In retrospect, it was not difficult to understand why Pope Francis had renounced his office. Even an open-minded, modern, and progressive pope was not ready to accept truths which contradicted 2,000 years of Christian belief. 1. Hans. Hans Staffel, son of General Hans Staffel and grandson of General Hans Staffel, the only surviving member of the failed July 20th plot to kill Hitler, was staring at his half-finished plate of spaghetti carbonara as Earth raced by some 450 kilometers below. He sat in the far corner of the Asimov, the best canteen on the lot. Not that it meant much, but food was cooked, not printed, and this made all the difference when you spent enough time up here. The Asimov was a bleak, gray-green room where people hunched over their plates in quiet resignation, while TV screens flashed visual white noise off the walls. The ticker at the bottom of the screen indicated they were showing something about a gunship exploding on its way to the Titan. The scrubbers were making dull mechanical noises behind a wall panel. This stuff should be silent, thought Hans. It was not supposed to remind you that you were hurtling through space at one orbit every hour in 33 minutes, and that your supply of air was in such fragile hands. Hans hated the thought of being so far from the ground and not being in the pilot seat. Considering how attracted he was to terrestrial life, he had difficulty understanding how he had become a fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe first, and then an entrepreneur piloting his own lift. When he flew commercial, he still asked for the aisle seat because it gave him the feeling he would not be trapped in case the plane called a mayday, as if aisle or window would make a difference if the plane dropped out of the sky. Hans stared at what was left of his spaghetti. There was something different about eating carbonara up here. Maybe it was the recycled water, or maybe it was the scrubbed oxygen. Hans's latest theory blamed the eggs. Eggs did not take well to artificial gravity. A news anchor on one of the screens was celebrating the winner of Big Brother Mars, Russian edition. "This brought the total number of guests to 6, said Gideon Rush, the anchor. A small logo in the corner indicated that this was Rush Hour with Gideon Rush. The Indian and U.S. members would be up next. Once the 16 guests had been selected, they would fly to Mars for a 9-month stay on the Red Planet. All the major networks across the world had been hyping up the show for the last 2 years, and it was believed it would be the most viewed program in history, ahead of the Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, and the British royal weddings, concluded Gideon with genuine pride. Hans looked up and groaned quietly as he saw Eddie walking in. "The Valkyrie's not for sale," he said. "I'm not here for that," said Eddie. "What can I do for you in this case?" said Hans, forcing up the corners of his mouth. "I have a drop for you." Hans nodded. "I need you to do it now." "Is that why you came here?" "I already have a drop," said Hans. "I can be back in 12 hours. "That won't do. My drop is time sensitive. Switch them around." "Customers don't like when I pull this kind of shit." "I could make it worthwhile." Hans shook his head. "JFC, Hans, you owe me this one and much more." Eddie hated cursing. Hans stared at Eddie. The two couldn't have looked more different. Eddie was short and overweight. He had beady eyes, a handlebar mustache, and a bald spot which tapered off into a ponytail. He reminded Hans of a fish, a crafty one. Hans, on the other hand, could have been the poster boy for holidays in Bavaria, tall, athletic, with sand-colored hair and blue eyes. "Do I hear a yes?" said Eddie, putting on a smile which did not reach his eyes. The world rushed beneath their feet. Forests, mountains, and oceans sped by as the lot raced through its orbit. Eddie had been Hans's instructor at Holloman Air Base in New Mexico. They had met again, years later, during a NATO training when Hans was having difficulty landing on the USS Nimitz due to heavy crosswinds. "JFC, is that you, kid?" Hans had heard over the radio. "Eddie?" he had replied, barely recognizing him. "Bank more into the wind and stop crabbing. The wind is strong and coming in gusts. Do you copy?" "Roger that." "Then why are you doing the opposite?" "Because that is what you taught me," Hans had fired back, grinning. "Just do as I say. You can buy me a drink when we port, okay?" "Okay." "And stop grinning," Eddie had added. Hans had stopped crabbing and banked into the wind. For a moment he thought he would be off axis, but a gust realigned him with the runway just as he was about to touch down. The tailhook of his Panavia Tornado snagged the third of the 4 arresting wires, and the hydraulic system slowed the plane down to a halt. The Nimitz never ported during Hans's stay. He only got to pay his debt years later when Eddie convinced Hans to join him as one of the first private contractors on the lot. The partnership only lasted a couple of months. Hans had told himself he did not want to be tied down to someone telling him what to carry, where, and when. It would have been too much like being back in the Luftwaffe, and he had just left the Luftwaffe. The reality was that Hans liked the Air Force. The armed forces had been a family tradition for 3 generations. Back then, he had no idea why he left. He did not understand that the problem had nothing to do with hierarchy. "What's the cargo?" asked Hans, looking at his egg-challenged spaghetti. "Batteries." "Batteries? Why do you need me for that?" "We just had a delivery. The cargo arrived a couple of hours ago. Did you see the freighter when you docked?" asked Eddie, looking away. "Why do you need me for an AG drop?" insisted Hans. "You are to go to LXD," said Eddie. "It's a 2 manifest job." 2 manifest jobs were not legal. You could lose your license for pulling shit like that. Even jail time. On the other hand, LXD's lack of security and the sheer extent of the corruption were legendary. There were few places which could be considered better for a 2 manifest job. LXD, Sao Paulo's former Viracopos International Airport, had been expanded in a bid to become South America's main hub for shipping cargo to and from the lot. The airport had been renamed in honor of Luiz Dantas, the Brazilian diplomat who was awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations for having helped hundreds of Jews flee from Nazi France. "I can add something for the inconvenience," said Eddie. "How much?" "Double?" The formula for good money was simple. First, you got into a position where you were the gatekeeper to a valuable commodity. Second, you earned the trust of the right people. And third, you signaled that you were willing to bend the rules for the proper reward. If there was any indication that something was off, it was when Eddie doubled the rate. But Hans was too busy counting the money and remembering how many times Eddie had got him out of trouble to notice this. "The next window for an LXD drop is in 40 minutes, said Eddie, looking at his watch. Larger than the largest aircraft carrier, the George Washington, the Lot, was the United States' projection of power in space. Over 100,000 metric tons of arachnographene, steel, and fiber optics orbited 450 kilometers above the equator. It was the largest vessel built by mankind and an engineering wonder in its own right. It had taken 3 years from design to deployment, a true marvel considering it had twice the mass of a normal aircraft carrier and that all components had to be flown into orbit before final assembly. A satisfied grin appeared on Hans's lips as Eddie left. He turned his attention back to his plate, questioning if he should eat the pasta. Even cold carbonara was still carbonara, and Hans was not going to recycle any of it. He finished it quickly and then cleaned off the plate with bread. Hans was serious about his food. Hans found Art, his partner on the Valkyrie, passed out in Sector C. Somebody told him Art had gone all in one too many times, lost everything, and then decided to dedicate the rest of the night to drinking. Art was not going to be of any help getting the Valkyrie down to the mainland. Hans would split today's drop money with Art, as he did when he found him in this state. Flying solo was more of an interference with his pre-flight routine than an actual risk, but insurance would not pay if you flew without a co-pilot. I should have a routine for this, thought Hans. It was happening often enough. You want to join us? Asked a guy with a big pile of chips stacked in front of him. Hans shook his head. Wise man, commented another. He took money off Jens too. Hans had no idea who Jens was. Tall dude, bald, round face, he continued. Biggest thief in the LEO. Art almost cleaned him up, but then Jens claimed some business with the new freighter, left, and when he returned, he won all his money back. All of it! Until Eddie came down and cleaned him out. Eddie who? Eddie Chapman. Jens was furious. You a friend of Eddie? Hans nodded. You tell him to be careful. I've seen him pull this shit on others. One day, he will piss somebody off. Art pushed himself up and stumbled out. Hans let him go without saying a word. He was in no condition for coherent thoughts. Have you seen the freighter docking? Asked the first. Fucking secretive they were today. They didn't even allow us close to those crates. They brought their own people to offload the cargo. Is this normal? Asked another who couldn't be more than 18. His jumpsuit still showed the fold marks of a new uniform, and the U.S. flag patch on his shoulder shimmered new in the dim light. He stood up slowly, probably following his drill instructor's instructions to avoid dizziness until he got accustomed to gravity pointing in one direction, while his inner ear told him he was moving in another. It was bullshit. Hans barely felt anything, even when moving from the outer to the inner levels. Hans had to admit that he too had been awed the first time he had seen a freighter dock, but wonder faded fast when you saw this every other day. Hell no! They're normally drinking while we're busting our asses. Not this time, though. This time, they were sober. They wheeled the cargo to the container units, locked them, and I heard they're still standing guard outside. If rumors are correct, they will stay until the shipment drops, and then they'll leave immediately. After 6 months stuck on that ship, I imagine they'd be hitting the bars until they no longer cared that they had another 6 months to get back home. The lot was claustrophobic. The ceilings were low, the corridors narrow, and the light never seemed to reach all the corners. The entire structure had been painted a monochromatic gray-green, and the sensation was that of crawling through the entrails of a gigantic beast, an angry, semi-dormant beast whose raspy breathing thrummed through the structure. Hans reached the bay where the Valkyrie was docked and found a Rhett waiting next to his lift. The Rhett mumbled something into his comms piece, and 15 minutes later, more Rhetts arrived, pushing a bunch of crates stacked on electric pallet trucks. One of the Rhetts handed Hans a tablet on which the AG battery's cargo was detailed. Hans signed the manifest after counting the crates and unlocked the hatch to the Valkyrie's cargo bay. He caught whiffs of rotting fish as they walked by. Small puffs of white powder gently exhaled from their sleeves and their trousers every time they moved. The Rhetts worked efficiently under the bright halogen lights. They didn't utter a sound besides a few grunts to indicate that a crate should be shifted over or that another had to be pushed all the way back. Hans kept his gaze on the crates to make sure they were being stowed properly. When finished, they stared at Hans until he climbed on board, closed the hatch, and locked the Valkyrie. Even then, they only left when they saw he was in that part of his pre-flight routine where he ignited the engines. Hans was a methodical person. He had a precise routine for everything important and alarms set up to make sure that he wouldn't forget even the simplest of things. Preparation for flying, being flying the thing he feared most, had developed into a superstitious liturgy. Hans picked up the giant's baseball cap he kept on his seat. He didn't wear it immediately. He first went through the paperwork, the operating handbook, the weight and balance, the insurance, and the manifest. Then came the visual inspection of the control panel. He sat down, tested the stick for strange noises, and started the automated pre-flight check. That was standard procedure. In the meantime, he ran his personal pre-flight check. When he was satisfied with that, he started the engines. He went into full burn for a couple of seconds and then slowly powered down again. He was putting on his baseball cap when the comms light flashed. It was Eddie asking him up to his office. Hans was sure there was no good reason for Eddie to want him in his office, but went anyway. He stormed back to the Valkyrie, asking himself why Eddie hadn't given him all the paperwork when they met in the canteen. Besides having missed his window, he had to go through his pre-flight routine again. The detachment sequence required no radio interaction with the lot's air control. He just received the green light and dropped. Re-entry was a simple matter with a lift. Drops were timed to make the most of the platform's momentum and for minimum fuel consumption. The Valkyrie would glide until the Kármán line, 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface, where the atmosphere started thickening. There, Hans would fire the engines to help him steer the turbulence and to fine-tune the re-entry angle. The Valkyrie needed a 40.5-degree angle not to bounce off the atmosphere. Eddie's instructions were to land in Brazil, just south of the border with Venezuela, some 3,500 kilometers north of the port of entry indicated on the manifest. The map showed he was heading for the kind of jungle where you needed a good machete just to open enough space to stand. There was no village or runway within 100 kilometers. A two-manifest job implied he would need to switch off his beacon as soon as he left the lot's radar cone and before entering any radar on the mainland. If anything happened to him in the middle of the jungle, nobody would even know he was there. Hans was never happy with this part. The Valkyrie began to shake as the atmosphere thickened, but Hans's hand was relaxed on the stick. The lift only required minimum thrust adjustments. He was practically gliding all the way down. The thick slab of arachnographene on the Valkyrie's belly reduced friction with air, cutting down on the problems caused by overheating which older aircraft models had struggled with. The display indicated that he had left the lot's radar cone. Hans reached over and deactivated the Valkyrie's beacon. In pilot lingo, he had gone dark.